tonight?
Yeah, so I'm going to introduce a person that doesn't even really need much of an introduction to many of you. His name is Sean Costello. He is the creator of Valhalla DSP. Valhalla DSP is very well known in the industry for its reverbs and delays and spatial audio plugins. And Sean has been kind enough to join us today. And so, once again, I encourage you, everybody that's listening in the chat, to ask questions. Make sure that you precede that with question, all in capitals. I'm not going to be talking from a very deep DSP perspective, so I encourage you, if you have deeper DSP questions, of course not too deep, but reasonable. But if you have more specific technical questions, please feel free to ask, and we will be going through these questions a little bit later. So, Sean, thank you for joining us this evening, this afternoon for you.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So I guess we could maybe start just by talking a little bit about your journey in DSP and as a plugin developer. How did you get started? When did you get started? And can you tell us a little bit about your progression?
Well, I started off doing computer audio probably back in 1983 when I had an Atari 400. But I'm not going to say I did anything terribly impressive with that. I was playing around with the audio and I didn't do anything really revolutionary. I remember, like, on my college application, I talked about I had ideas for using computers for music, and that's probably about as far as it went at that point in time. It's like, what if computers were used for music? And then in college, I did study. They had a really good computer music program at the time, but it was rather intimidating.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I remember my freshman year of college, I took a class from Julius Smith on the discrete Fourier transform. And like, I remember the classrooms, like the pre-qualifications, you needed high school algebra and trig. And I went into the class and it's like, why is everyone here like this old electrical engineering guy? I mean, like in their late 20s. That seemed old at the time.
Uh-huh.
And I did not do well in that class. And so, but I did take various computer music classes in college, and then, I don't know, 90s, just worked, slacked, played a lot of guitar, was into the various music scenes. Then I got into effects. I really got into fuzz pedals, and it's like, okay, I'm going to start building these, and then got into synthesizers. And there's limits, as you know, like back then, mid 90s, you could buy synthesizers pretty cheap. But I was really interested in the technology, and then I found myself getting more interested in computer music again. So around 1998, I went to our local university, University of Washington, that had a computer music program. I was like, I'm not a student here, but I'd like to take this year-long computer music course, and taught my way in and took that as a non-matriculated student. I really loved it. My wife and I moved down to the Bay Area at the end of '99. I started work at this place, Staccato Systems, which was an offshoot of Karma at Stanford, doing computer music stuff. And at the time, they actually were moving over to video game sound. So when I interviewed there, they were doing various computer music things, physical models, and early virtual analog stuff. And by the time I got there, I ended up modeling car engines for video games for a year and a half.
Wow.
And then, which was not quite what I signed up for, but there's so many, like, the people that I was working with were so smart. So I was just kind of asking, like, I asked questions. I always think of myself as like this kind of naive asking questions. It's like, hey, gee, it's like, but I was 30, so it was probably a little bit embarrassing asking questions like that. It's like, having said that, I learned so much. Our company ended up being acquired by Analog Devices, which makes semiconductors. Worked on DSP development for several years, and then after 2006 end of that, we all got laid off. I did consulting for a few years. The economy crashed 2008, and it's like, well, this would be a good time to do my own plugin company, because there was really no opportunities in Seattle at that point.
Yeah.
It's like either form my own plugin company or go into a different career. So my wife and I worked on this plugin company together, Kristen, and just kind of worked, got a Juice license, worked on code for a couple of years, put out our website, just hanging up our slate, and so started going live with our own plugins 2010 and have been going ever since.
Nice. And of course, all of the plugins that I've seen from Valhalla have always been spatially related. Is there a reason that you've gravitated towards that side of things? Did you feel that there was something that was missing in the plugin market that you could provide there, or what was the reasoning behind that?
I think my own neurology. I don't really know why. I mean, it's like, I don't even like, I like some music with long reverbs, especially like more the ambient stuff, but I also like music that has no reverb, that's very dry.
Mm-hmm.
I think that I'm probably less interested in reverb as a sonic thing in general than just reverb networks, algorithmic reverbs. It's kind of like playing some like mental puzzle. It's just this way is like, how can you take a very few building blocks and configure them together? Mm-hmm. And for some reason, just working with that, like working with those networks, really presented a nice challenge to my brain, and I was able to work with it. So I just keep coming up with these networks.
Yeah.
I mean, I've invented several hundred reverb algorithms, and most of them were not good. Mm-hmm. But I think it's just by trying these various things, configuring them together in different ways, I have come across things that are good, and then you learn from that and just keep building on it. So it's more just, it's less about, do I think that the world needs more reverb so much as my brain likes to work on that sort of thing.
Mm. And what in your opinion separates a good reverb from a bad reverb algorithmically?
Well, that's changed over time, my definition of that. Originally, it was something I was really looking at, probably reading the literature. It's like, well, echo density is a big thing. You shouldn't have something that's too grainy. It should quickly build up echo density. But you can build up echo density really quickly and have it sound metallic. Mm-hmm. And so in some ways that's related to modal density. And now I'm evolving to the point where it's like, it's not even modal density, it's the quality of the, of the resonances. Mm-hmm. And that's something it took me a good 20 years probably to really be able to hear that characteristic. So I feel that now I can hear things differently than I did 20 years ago. Like what I thought sounded good. Like I have a reverb I did in 1999 that is made into some freeware. At the time I thought that sounded good. Now I'm just like, oh God, that's like, it sounds real. It does not sound good to me, but it's also something that for me, realizing that subjectivity is a really big part of it, is that what sounds good to someone might not sound good to someone else. So, and that's been a big part of it. It's like, I think that for me, I've got standards of what I want the reverbs to sound like, but I can't say of the algorithms, like, is this one the best reverb? For example, like there's like something like Shimmer, which is like a very simple algorithm at its core. It's just a bunch of all pass delays in series. It has this very long decay, but it has this really strange attack depending on what the all pass coefficients are set at. And that attack is either completely, and long decay is either completely distracting or is really awesome, depending on the source material. And it's really something that you have to be, it's not just a reverb that you put onto a source to make it sound better. You almost have to interact with the reverb while you're making the music.
I see.
But some other reverbs, it's like, is it a goal? It's like, can you get a reverb that sounds good on anything? And that's like, that's still something that I'm working towards. It's like, can you get just a generically sounding, this sounds good everywhere, and in some, sounds natural. It's like, the sort of thing is like that, and honestly, the closer you get to that goal, the less the reverb is apparent, if that makes sense. Like the more naturalistic you get, the less you're going to notice it as something. So it's like a very lush, long, algorithmic, modulated reverb can be kind of like the star of the show, where it's like, but it's a lot maybe easier to do that than something that is really subtle and stays in the background.
And where do you find your inspirations for reverbs from? Do you find it from analog gear and then trying to imitate that, or is it more a matter of playing algorithmically with the equations? How do you find your inspirations for these?
Well, I mean, it started off, I think, because I was working with C sound. So I started off before I was like working on like trying to model a particular gear. I just tried out a bunch of stuff. I read every paper I could find on reverbs, and some of them it took years to understand.
Hmm.
You know, especially when you start getting into more like what you call feedback delay networks and matrices and matrices, all that sort of stuff. It gets really confusing. But I'd say like the first 10 years of working on this up till about 2010 was learning all these different topologies and reading all the literature. And since then, it's been how do you make these sound good? And it's also been like, you know, I have studied like, you know, get various, like not really analog reverb gear. I did some work with plate reverbs,
Hmm.
and that was cool. But that was like, but most of the reverbs had been digital, and just listening to older digital reverbs and adjusting the parameters, trying to figure out how they work, reading literature that probably maps to those, because a lot of the commercial stuff hasn't really been published.
Hmm. Hmm.
Or if it was published, the person got in trouble for doing that, or it's more like alluding to stuff that is actually, oh, if you trace it back, it's like, well, that person published this in 92 and he was working at this company in 87, and I know that what I've heard is that they reverse engineered this reverb back then. A lot of it is like what companies reverse what reverbs back in the 80s, and like
Mm.
whether or not they published it. So
Wow.
there's a lot of that, but then it's also realizing it's like, you know, and some of that is like the technology that you learn from that is like, oh, this is really primitive.
Mm.
This is not good. And it's like, yes, and it may, but it still might sound better than a more advanced algorithm,
Hmm.
like something that's more, and it's just a matter of learning. It's like, why is that?
Hmm. And do you
You know,
do you,
and
oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
oh, no, oh, no, you go.
I was going to say, and do you find conflict in that between a simple algorithm that maybe it sounds superior in your subjectively to something that maybe is more impressive algorithmically, but maybe doesn't sound as good? Do you find a
I've, I've,
conflict in
I've,
that?
I've had problems with that. I think what it comes down to is that the a goal is like hopefully the more that I work on this, the less my own ego and pride gets in the way.
Mm.
It's like, you know, if there's something that I think like, you know, this is really clever, and the end user has no idea what's going on under the hood. They don't know whether it's clever or simple. They just know what it sounds like. And the end users can report, well, this doesn't sound good, or this sounds like, you know, and listening to, you know, definitely like listening to other people's ears besides my own, getting feedback on that. And so it's just something that's like, you know, there's the cleverness of the algorithm, and then there's what sounds good. And but you know, hopefully I'm learning like, okay, if this sounds better, why does it sound better, and can I put it into some sort of analytic framework? So it's not just like, you know, slavishly recreating something from the past. It's like, you know, but sometimes you need to do that. Sometimes you need to sit there and really try your best to recreate something in order to understand it. It's like learning from someone else.
Hmm.
And
And
then it's like, how do you, like, what does that mean? And that can take years. Like, I think it's like some of the stuff that I did in vintage verb, it took me several years to understand how I think it works. And I'll never know if it's exactly how it works because people don't share this sort of stuff.
hmm.
It's like how I think it works. And then it's like, why does that sound different than what I did in, say, Valhalla Room?
Hmm.
Like, why, you know, it's like, which use much more like kind of more academic type technology.
Yeah. So you were speaking earlier about literature, and we saw before the live stream started, we saw the extent of your library. Can you show everybody your a quick shot of your of
Yeah, so this right here is like, those are mostly, that shelf right there is mostly like the DSP books.
mm,
Like the stuff on like what would be the left are like, you know, going from the top, those are like these computer music books I dragged around with me for the last 20 years or
hmm.
20 plus years. Some cases, like there's one I got in 1988. Then there's more just digital signal processing books. And then over to the right, there's more of like more of the analog stuff. I don't know if you can see, like I've got some service manuals. I don't think you can see it there. Yeah, but yeah, there's a fair amount of like service manuals I have from like analog synths and electronotes and stuff like that. Like I've done a lot of study on more synthesizer stuff, even though I haven't really made any synthesizer plugins.
Yeah.
So, and that, but it's just an interest. And then over, you know, I've got other various music books and stuff in here. So
Yeah. And do you For the DSP books, do you have any recommendations that you could give people? What are your favorites for DSP?
Well, those are changing. I should have grabbed one from the shelf. Hang on one sec. Well, so this is what I learned off the computer music.
Uh-huh.
It's good. It's dated, but one of the things that's interesting about dated is like it's still useful sounds. Like technology, I've got a book on computer music by Max Matthews from 1969,
Mm-hmm.
and the algorithms in it are still useful. They're not state of the art, but they sound good.
Mm-hmm.
I'd say for my own personal reverb stuff, there's a chapter in this book
Mm-hmm.
written by William Gardner, and that was really influential on. It was the best survey that I had read about reverb development at the time, and this came out like 1998.
Wow.
Modern books, I really like. I just got this one.
Mm-hmm.
This is by Will Perkle at University of Miami,
Yeah.
and it's pretty great. The first edition of it was okay,
Yeah.
but this is the second edition. I didn't know there was a second edition until a couple of weeks ago, and it's great.
Yeah.
It's really good. It talks about like, and one of the things, he also has a book on designing software like this one, like about synths.
Yep.
And what's really cool about those books is that he explains some of this, like, what do you call it? Zero delay feedback filters, this new modeling technology for filters.
Mm-hmm.
And his explanations of it are a lot clearer than I think some of the other people that have, done work in that field. And like, amazing pioneering work in the field, but maybe not as comprehensible to people without a very extensive math background.
Yeah.
And the other book, I'm not going to go grab it from the shelf, but the DAFX book edited by Udal Zolcer is great. That's just a very great book. And then all the DAFX papers are really useful.
Yeah. And what are you planning on continuing in the spatial realm for the future, or do you ever tire of it, or do you feel that the deeper that you go, the more that you are discovering, and the more that you want to stay in this particular space?
All of that, every one of those. I mean, like for example, like I was playing around during this time, like after doing, like I did this free plugin Valhalla Supermassive. After that, I started playing around like with phase shifting algorithms, which I love. I love a classic swept phase shifter. I've got a whole bunch of them here, and it's cool to like learn the modeling of that. And yet I don't know if that's like going to be an actual Valhalla product at some point, because it's just, I don't know if it fits in. But, I definitely see like like, for example, several years back, I was working on Valhalla Delay, and I was really frustrated with the development at that point. And I just did some work. Okay, I need to come up with a really transparent, clean sounding reverb. And I just started coding all these algorithms and just trying to evaluate them. It was just like, nope, doesn't sound good. Nope, yes, nope. Okay, let's go back to that yes. And so at some point, I'd like there'll be like that work I'm going to want to bring out into a totally different plugin, because it's very different than other stuff I've done before. So.
Nice.
And then and I'm sure but I would like to explore other effects. I mean, I love, one of the things I have sitting around here, I have a huge amount of fuzz pedals. I don't know if those would be, what form that'd be, but I do love distortion and overdrive.
Amazing. Valhalla Overdrive. I think that would be really something. So let's talk about, so one thing that I've noticed in your plugin aesthetic is that you prefer very simple UIs, and that it would be very, I think that it'd be very easy for you to say that your reverbs are modeled after some old piece of gear, and that you have some sort of 3D pseudo-realistic skeuomorphic UI, but you've chosen to stay with very clean and very simplistic design. And I was wondering your thoughts on that.
Well, part of that is like Kristen, the other person, like main person in Valhalla DSP, she really had a lot to do with that. Like I remember we were talking about the original stuff, and I was trying to do, like in the early days of working with Juice, I was doing some like film strip knobs, and she was drawing a GUI mock-up, and she did it with this very simple colors and then circles with lines on it for the knobs. and, like very like using Futura. And I was like, that's it.
Mm.
I love that. It's because it's just so, to me, it like, I really love, I mean, it's weird because it's like, I know it's like my office looks more like, some weird, you know, university library or hobbit house or something like that. But I also really love very modern, like flat graphic design. I love the Swiss school stuff. So there's just something about those GUIs that just really, like that, those prototypes you did that really resonated. And
Mm.
so, I mean, and I think there's something, it's like, I could say it's like, it's more honest because it's like, it's not really like it's not modeled, because it's like, even if I model gear, I'm going to be basing it like on, there's still my interpretation going to be in there. So it's really more about having something that reflects where I'm at. But there's nothing particularly superior about flat GUI versus skeuomorphic. It's just all, I mean, it's like, it's what people resonate with. And in this case, it's like our aesthetics here in the company
Mm-hmm.
really resonate with these flat GUIs. So that's part of it. But I think we put a lot more work now into not necessarily the graphic part of it, but the user experience part of it. Trying to
Mm-hmm.
figure out like the biggest issue I had with Valhalla delay is like, how do you take all these different delays and model them and leave out as many controls as possible
Mm-hmm.
and make it a simple to use tool? Like I always talk about, like I've got somewhere around here, I don't know where, but a Swiss Army knife. And it's
Mm.
like a Swiss Army knife is an amazing tool. It's got, it's got the knife, it's got the screwdriver, it's got the saw, and it's like it can do all these things, and it's not particularly great at any of them other than the knife part.
Yeah.
It makes a lousy screwdriver. It's a horrible hammer. It's got a good toothpick, but it's like, but the idea of like, how do you make something that's like, how do you design a tool that is simple to use? Because that's something that's like, the more experience I got, like the more I worked with customers, realizing that a lot of the customers, especially as you get more into the pro audio space, they're the most valuable commodity that they have is time.
Mm.
And the more controls you give them, the more time they have to think about it. A lot of cases, people do not want to spend all the time thinking about it. So it's like, how do you minimize the user controls in such a way that it's like, it's still enough to give people what they want to do, but no more than that, and just kind of stay out of the way? Because I don't like, if like early tool, like I did this plugin Valhalla Ubermod, and it's based on originally based on a Dimension D, but then extended it to like stereo delay lines, up to 32 taps, diffusion, different things. It became this really crazy like modulation thing. And it's really cool. I love playing with it. It has like 40 parameters on it. The original Dimension D had 4 push buttons.
Mm-hmm.
And if you wanted a chorus, you just pressed 1 or 2 of those buttons, and that's the sound that you got. And realizing that's like, try to do something that's somewhere, like you can't really, like a plugin with 4 buttons may not be enough. You want more versatility with that, but you don't necessarily want to have like, or some people do want to have all the controls, but a lot of people really want something that's simpler so that they can work faster. So it's like, how do you design something simpler? And the more I think about that, is something that you kind of have to look at the, not just the user experience level, but going to the algorithmic level.
Mm-hmm.
Like, for example, like, the diffusion parameter that you see in a ton of reverbs is really there. It's like, how do you control the echo density?
Mm-hmm.
And it originally stems from the fact that most reverbs have controlled echo density by controlling the coefficients of series all passes in front of the reverb. And by adjusting that coefficient, you can get a more dense reverb, but you also get a more metallic reverb. And so that's kind of a choice that you gave the user to decide whether you wanted something that was like dense and metallic, or sparse and kind of clacky but more open.
Mm-hmm.
And when you get into a nice acoustic space, you don't have to make that decision. It's made for you.
Mm-hmm.
You have density in a good acoustic space, and you have, and it doesn't sound metallic at all. So it's more about like, if you wanted to eliminate the diffusion control, you have to figure out how do you do diffusion that doesn't sound metallic.
Mm-hmm.
And that's still a goal that's like, ongoing in my stuff.
Mm-hmm. So hearing what you're saying, it sounds like you prefer a plugin that maybe has a certain type of character over a plugin that tries to do everything all in one plugin.
Yes, and that as again is my preference. It's like, and just more like it's not like saying that is how plugins have to be. It's just you have to take a stance on stuff.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, just like not like not like a moral stance, but it's like in order to do something, it's good if you strike a position. It's like we want to do more minimal plugins. We want to do plugins with more minimal interfaces. Not saying that it's the solution, just that this is a solution that we can stand behind and feel good about.
Mm-hmm. So when you say we, I was surprised when you mentioned that there were other people in Valhalla besides yourself. I was wondering if you could tell a little bit about your team, a little bit about the division of duties.
Sure. Yeah. So Kristen Costello, we've known each other for a long time. It's like, but she is her division of stuff is like she deals with more. I guess I'm more sound and she is more vision. And the vision deals with both the visual side of things, like working on the plugin designs and the colors, the actual graphic user interfaces, but the website, like the driving the development of that. And like we've had web developer teams that have been working with us lately, so we hired that out. We worked with a firm, Belief Agency in Seattle, and then like Cool Blue Web doing our web development. But those, like, Kristen was really in charge of those projects. She's been in charge of the web development, which is, a huge thing, because that's how stuff gets sold. So it's like the smoother that works, the better it is for a customer experience.
Mm-hmm.
And then so that's and then it's also vision, as far as like what are the directions of the company, because there's always like, I could sit there and obsessively work on things I'm interested in, but it's like what are things that make more sense actually moving forward from a like a business decision and stuff like that.
Sure.
And then part-time we have Don Gunn, who's a local engineer and producer, and he does customer support and also helps with like driving new products and stuff like that. And we have him doing customer support because he works in DAWs and studios all the time. And I really don't. I came from more of a academic computer music environment, and yeah, I always have Ableton Live fired up like pretty much all day, but I'm not necessarily like as skilled as like very skilled at all in making music in Pro Tools and Live and Logic and all the other DAWs that are out there. And so Don is experienced in that, which is really useful when you've got someone that's like working on a movie and it's like, okay, we've got an issue with this plugin running on an HDX system. It's like Don has an HDX system, so he's able to deal with those sort of like higher level questions that I would just be completely lost at.
And what was I going to ask? I just lost my train of thought. Oh, yes. So your latest plugin was actually free, and I was wondering if you could just talk a little bit about that, the vision, and how you get to a point where you say, okay, I've been working on this thing for X amount of time, and now I'm going to give it out. What do you feel is the value proposition there? And can you just talk a little bit about what your vision is?
Well, that the free plugin Valhalla Supermassive actually stemmed out of a couple of lectures that I gave. I haven't given too many like academic lectures, but I was invited to go up to the University of Victoria in Victoria, British Columbia, to talk about reverbs, and they were working in Max MSP there.
Yeah.
And so I learned for that Max for Live. I hadn't worked with Max much, so I created a whole bunch of kind of simple reverb algorithms, and then also simpler ways of kind of showing how like delays in parallel versus delays in series sounded. And I had this knob to adjust the relative delay lengths of those, and there's a lot of neat effects that came out of that knob. And so I made this one plugin, I called it Supermassive, like a Max for Live thing, and it was it sounded cool. I was like, this is great. It was not that complicated for considering things. It's like it used like 16 delay lines. My reverbs use anywhere from 32 up to more than 80 delay lines in them. So, but it's like, but it's for that, but it used really long delay lines. And so it's like, this is cool. And then, I took the ferry up to Victoria, BC, and it was really pretty up there. It was a really cool school. And I came back home, and within a week, everything shut down. That's when the pandemic really kicked in here, and it kicked in kind of early. And just realized, like, everything is going to shut down. And it's like, well, this would be a good time. Like, I'm really enjoying this supermassive idea, these concepts in there. And talked with Chris and Don. It's like, this would be a good free plugin, which is interesting because I hadn't done a free reverb plugin before. But I looked at it, it's like, well, this is something, it's like, it's very cool. It's also limited. It's not really a good small room reverb, but it does really big things. And was able to experiment with, like, how do I have 16 delay lines. Each of them can be up to 2 seconds long. What can I do with that?
Yeah.
What are the various ways that I can make these things hook together? So it's just like, basically and that's where it's kind of like, I mean, I'd say it's like, it's creativity. It's like, well, it's like creativity if you have like 16 Legos and you can plug them together. It's like, there's limited things that you can do, but I get inspired by that. I got really inspired by like playing with the limitations, and was really like, what sort of sounds can you do with this? And then, I mean, there's even a few things where it's like the density control on that came from, I put together a GUI, and it's like, well, there's a spot right here that needs a knob. And it's like, well, what about something that controls the echo density in a different way than the other stuff? So that's where the designing the user interface helped inform the algorithm, but in the really base level of like, oh, I need to put a knob there.
Amazing. And of course, with the recent WWDC, we've seen that Apple is now moving towards ARM chips, and that the line between what we see with desktop computers, laptops, and what we have on mobile devices is starting to blur. And we've had that price differentiation between what people will pay for an iOS app versus something that you have on your desktop. And I'm wondering if you've had any thoughts or direction moving forward in terms of, do you think that that's going to be, what sort of challenges do you think as an indie developer that's going to bring for you? And do you have any solutions or proposed approaches for how to navigate that space?
Well, speaking of that, I'm definitely going to be developing for the new, I always called it ARM Max, but now I guess the official term is Apple Silicon. Like I've got the dev kit for that. I will be porting all the Valhalla plugins over to that. For now, I'm going to be staying in the desktop space. And it's more because I think that when Apple started the mobile stuff, they also started a tradition of having things priced at this $5 price point. And I think that, like, and it's also, I think, a very different end user. My stuff is like, we have a survey. I know that about 2/3 of the people that use the Valhalla plugins make some to all of their money from the plugins. So I definitely want to keep aim towards that sort of computer project space. It also seems like I've talked with people like, Chris Randall from Audio Damage, like we're chatting constantly. He's a lot of fun. And so I get an idea of like this amount of work that's needed for the iOS space. And it's like jumping through Apple's hoops on that is probably more than I want to take on this time. It's like I've spent the weekend, a lot of last week and yesterday dealing with some Apple hoops. It's like, things that get surprising where it's like, oh, so this apparently changed yesterday, or just because I've had to set up a new machine, all of a sudden my other machine stops working, and it stops working because there's some new signing requirements that I didn't know before. And so it's like that stuff that you have to constantly be figuring out. I mean, it happens with Microsoft, but much more with Apple. So it's just like keeping that going. It's like, that's, it's like learning that stuff as like on the desktop side, that's kind of enough for me to tackle at this point in time. Just limited resources.
Absolutely. As an indie developer, we have a lot of people that come into the community that are looking to become indie developers and look up to companies such as yours. What do you have any sort of pieces of advice for people that are looking to get started in a one person or two person shop developing their own plugins?
I don't know if is it okay to like plug one of your sponsors for the show?
Oh, of course, yeah.
I I don't know how I would have been able to continue doing this work without Juice.
Hmm.
Juice has been able, like, so, I mean, I'm not saying that it's been completely smooth or completely flawless, but with the transitions going between like from, you know, 32-bit to 64-bit, and then moving over to the new ARM Max, going from RTAS on Pro Tools to AAX, all these different changes. The fact that the Juice framework has been kept up to date and keeps expanding to all these target areas has been invaluable.
Mm.
And then it's like you can create a Juice plugin that then becomes all these formats. I mean, I forget about VST3, which I've done like internally. All the stuff's been ported to VST3 for a while, but we need to test stuff more, because it's like, having said that, it's just like that Juice just like makes these things targets. So you don't really need to learn the specific like SDKs of all these people. Like, I mean, it used to be when I started off, I was really trying to learn the audio unit SDK, and then that changed, and the documentation got hidden, but
Yeah.
Juice, it didn't really matter to them. It's like, well, you just click that audio unit box and it ports to audio units.
Yeah.
I mean, it's kind of amazing. I have done some, it's like, like the places where this can port, it can be really good. So my first advice would be learn Juice. And then my other big advice is just give your, like, I'd say like the books I recommended, read as much as you can. And then I'd say the approach, I really like, give yourself something simple to start with. I'm working with a student right now at UW, and it's like, okay, it's like for a Juice plugin, try a state variable filter. Something that like sounds good, you know what it is, and then you can build on that. So sort of that stone soup of like something small, and you build on that iteratively, and then you can build up your own DSP library.
Yeah.
And the final thing is just be patient with yourself. This stuff can take a long time to learn. It can take a long time to understand. You've got, it's like, give yourself time, and like be kind of nice to yourself when stuff is frustrating, because it's frustrating to everyone.
Yeah.
And that is the other thing too, is that it's like, it's amazing to me. It's like, like there's so many plugin companies. It seems like, well, this is like a saturated market. It's like, well, it really isn't. If you go into this, like look at people's studio computers, it's not like they have one reverb and one delay. People keep accumulating stuff. For the most part, people don't get rid of that much stuff, and people use different tools for different reasons. The more that it's like the more you get into the tools, the more you might appreciate the differences between the tools.
Yeah.
And it's a fairly friendly community.
Yeah.
I'm on, it's like I'm like on this Discord chat, and it's like all these developers are like really trying to help each other out. Like when Apple throws a new wrench into the works, people are talking about here's how you do this. Because it's like, it'd be great. And that's why I love Juice and like the friendliest communities. It'd be great. It's like, for whatever level we have to compete, it'd be great if we could compete in the realm of ideas versus like who's able to keep up with the changing world and who isn't. It'd be great if it just like all that stuff was like, it'd be nice if like software development for say Apple was as easy as it is to set up a new iPad.
Yeah.
If there's a wizard for that sort of stuff. So, but having said that, it's like, because there isn't that, like other developers, I found have been helping each other out, and I really appreciate that. It's a friendly space. I think it's a non-zero sum place. It's not like if you're doing well, someone else is doing poorly.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
that's great.
I really like that.
Yeah, living in a world of abundance rather than scarcity. I like that approach. I have a million more questions that I could ask, but I'm sure that people in the chat must have a load of questions. We have probably about 15, 20 minutes for some questions from the community. What do we have, Teamer?
Yeah, we have quite a few questions. So Taylor is asking whether you are prototyping your algorithms in C.
C++.
C++.
Yes. Yeah, and I will say that it was interesting prototyping stuff I hadn't really worked with Max for Live, that was cool. I enjoyed that. I think that was a really, like, I was able to get ideas prototyping there that I would not necessarily anywhere else. Having said that, once you get like large reverb networks start looking horrible in the visual space.
Yeah.
It's like if you do like in a visual design based language, it's a sort of thing where it's like, you know, massive parallelism ends up looking like spaghetti wiring, you know, versus, especially because I like, at least as far as my understanding in Max MSP, I know they have this multi-channel connections now, but I don't think that the things you connect the multiple channels to can be different.
Hmm.
So versus like in C++, that's a for loop or a couple of for loops.
Yeah.
Nested.
Right.
Okay.
So we have a couple of related questions. So Peter's asking, a lot of the classic reverb algorithms are proprietary. How did you go about learning what makes a good reverb?
Well, I really think it's like reading every bit of literature out there. And it's like, and I really do think that it's a matter of like reading, coding, and like a lot of talking with other people about stuff.
Hmm.
But the best way to really understand reverb algorithms is, for me, is to just code them all. Code everything you can, learn something, code it, like tweak it out, come up with your own variations of it. And it is something about like learning, like the, you know, like getting the right academic source, which is right. That Will Perkle book, like this book, the chapter in it is really great. Last I looked, this book was like $175, and it's like 22 years old. So I do think that this Will Perkle chapter in here, he's updated it, and he's updated it with stuff that is like both newer and older, if that makes sense. He like, because he incorporated some of Keith Barr's ideas. Keith Barr, rest in peace. He was the founder of MXR, and later on the founder of Alesis. And then his last venture was founding this company, Spin Semiconductor, which makes this little tiny DSP, the FB1, which is used in all these stomp pedals now, and is a user programmable DSP. It's tiny. It's like, it seems primitive. It can do 128 instructions per sample, but if you work with the limitations of it, it can be very powerful for making reverbs. And the nice thing about Keith Barr's work is that he published a ton of useful information, like both like kind of just like general information with illustrations as well as source code on his website, which is spinsemiconductor.com.
Mm.
Right. So
And the Will Perkle book now incorporates his own takes on that. So it's like it's really cool to see, like, you know, that which is like both newer ideas for the Will Perkle book, but then ideas that go back, like when I talked to Keith Barr, he figured out this stuff in the 80s by tweaking the controls on a Lexicon 224.
Yeah,
I just kind of got the idea.
I like the Will Parker book as well. It's like the new edition just came out, I think, last year. So it's like really, I have it on my shelf as well. I have to admit, I haven't gone through all of it yet, but it seems like a very good resource.
Yeah, we've tried. So I was going to say we've tried a couple times to get Will Perkle on the meetup. So Will, if you're watching this, we need you to come in and give a talk for us.
Yeah, you have a lot of fans around here. Speaking of publishing, Gashpur is asking whether you would ever consider publishing the best of your algorithms.
I don't know. I think it all comes down to, like, at some point I want to make the slides public that I did at University of Victoria, as well as like the Max for Live patches. I wouldn't say that those were the best of my patches, but the ideas within them are what, like, all the reverbs do. So it's kind of like simplified build from there. And part of me is like, there is something to be said about, I like some of the secrecy. It gives, it's like, there's something that's a bit of a challenge about it. It's like, okay, this stuff is secret. And knowing that it's like, really, it's different than the academia. Because the academia is great, but there's something about the secrecy. It's like, I always thought of it as like, almost like a grimoire. It's like this kind of secret knowledge that you had to somehow deduce or acquire. Every now and then you might get, like, you know, the John DeToro published several reverb algorithms that are from this stuff, and kind of like learning, like, you know, like doing the tracing of, like, not only knowing that he published these things, but then talking to people and like knowing like, oh, he did this at this company then. There's something I really like about that. So I probably won't be publishing the stuff that's in my plugins exactly, but you know, I can tell people it's like, you know, like like half of them are like all pass loops and half of them are FDNs with my own, you know, there's some things I've got advances on them, but you know, it's like that are not in the standard literature, but a lot of it is. It's just a matter of like really finding the right literature. And I'd say that it's like literature wise, like Keith Barr, John DeToro, Michael Gerzon wrote some papers in the early 70s that are still like I'd say that Valhalla Supermassive was basically a tribute to those early papers.
Mm.
Right.
Amazing.
So speaking about
someone said posthumously. I don't want to die for a while. So
So we have another question asking, how much have modern reverberators deviated from the Schroeder design?
I'd say that the instant that you started having commercial reverberators, they deviated from the Schroeder design.
Right.
Which is something like that. And this is something that's like, I haven't really talked with too many of the old time reverb developers, but I know, for example, like the first commercial reverb was the EMT, digital commercial reverb was the EMT 250. And the second one, I think, well, maybe it might be the case that the Ursa Major space station was number 2, but I think the second or third was the Lexicon 224. And in the case of both the Lexicon and the EMT, the developers, Greisinger for the Lexicon and Barry Blesser for the EMT, they both built hardware that allowed them to listen to their reverb algorithms in real time. Like, you know, it took, you know, I have to program, compile it, but then they could tweak knobs. And I think that made a huge difference in quality from the Schroeder. Schroeder, you have to remember, was doing time sharing on some giant IBM mainframe at Bell Labs. So it would take like a couple of days, possibly hours to days, to compile his audio. Then he literally had to take the digital information on a tape and drive it 30 miles to where there is the only digital analog converter in the, you know, for the Bell Labs company. So, and then he was like, be able to put that on tape. So that's not really a quick iterative way of learning stuff. So Schroeder stuff sounded amazing considering the limitations that he had. But as soon as in the 70s, when this real-time reverb hardware was developed, they tried the Schroeder algorithms and found them lacking. So they developed techniques like Barry Blesser developed modulated delay lines as a technique, and David Greisinger did modulated delay lines plus all pass loops, nested all pass loops, stuff like that, as a way of just getting the sound to sound better. So I think that was like, Schroeder was abandoned very quickly for the most part. Now you will see some stuff like, there's definitely like Yamaha, if you look at their patents, they had some very advanced variations on Schroeder type reverbs. And I think like some of those, like Sony as well, you'd see these constant density reverbs so that if you do a big enough Schroeder and it's well tuned, it can sound good. I'd say that it's like an FDN that's well tuned would sound better than that. And I'd say that all pass loops for people just starting out this are far more forgiving as far as delay lengths and stuff like that.
All right. So we have another question about reverbs. So Justin is asking, I'm currently developing a synth and adding effects. What would be a good starting point for adding a decent sounding reverb, which is not tinny and good with synth sounds?
I'd say either look at like the 1997 DeToro reverb, which so many people have implemented. I'd look at the spin semiconductor stuff, especially as like published by Will Perkle. And I'd also just take a bunch of all pass delays in series, modulate each of those with its own thing, and then like take the output from that all pass and then take a delay line and a filter and feedback that with the feedback coefficient. Like it turns out for synth stuff, just like what I call all pass loops, or like, you know, or a bunch of all passes in series with feedback around it, can sound really good for synthesizers. It's a simple structure. You can start experimenting with different ways of tuning the all pass delays.
That's really useful. Thank you very much. I have one question which I find interesting, actually. So Archie, which I find especially interesting because I've looked into this stuff at some point. So Archie 3D is asking, what's your opinion on physical modeling and convolution when you compare that to like algorithmic reverbs, which is what we were talking about before?
That's an interesting question. As far as physical modeling, I think that they are limited by the resolution of the model. I mean, all depends if you're talking about like, I was very much like, I think that there's kind of, like you talk about West Coast versus East Coast rap and synthesis. I think there's very much a West Coast US versus European physical modeling. And I think that like the waveguide stuff, a lot of the waveguide stuff end up being for like algorithmic FDNs. It's good. When you get to like, but there's also the physical modeling where you have like finite difference networks, or whereas instead of having like 20 delay lines, you have several 100 million resonators or several tens of thousands of resonators, and that stuff can sound amazing. It's just not something that can be done in real time. Like an actual concert hall, you need to have several billion resonators to second order resonators to model it correctly. And that's just not something we can do in real time. As far as convolution, convolution is weird in that I think that convolution theoretically should sound much better than it does. And I don't think that has anything to do with the concept of playing convolution reverb. Like, it's not about the playback. I think the convolution engines, especially like with the zero latency stuff that came around starting in the 90s, it can be a very great technology. Now, you can't get modulation, all that, whatever. It still can sound very good. I do think, though, that it's like a lot of convolution reverbs that I've heard have a strange sort of like, almost like too much presence in the sound. It almost sounds resonant in a strange way. And I don't know, there's nothing necessarily about the technology itself that should do that as far as playback. I wonder if it has something to do with, we have not yet figured out the ideal way of capturing a convolution impulse. And for example, I know that at Stanford, they did this project where someone went into the Hagia Sophia and like this giant 6th century building, but it's a museum right now. It's not a music space. There's people in it, and popped a balloon. Then they took the balloon pop, and instead of using that as the impulse response, they looked at the energy and echo density in like 24 different frequency bands and resynthesized, like with Gaussian noise of increasing density, like the echo response of that space. And the results are gorgeous. It's like this beautiful, like very realistic sounding impulse response. And to me, that shows that convolution can sound really beautiful. I think it's more about how you're generating the impulse responses for it.
Right. So thanks. Yeah, that's really interesting about the Hagia Sophia. So we have like dozens more questions on the chat, but it's like we have another talk coming up, so I'm not sure. I think we need to stop at some point.
Yeah, maybe 5 more minutes.
Okay.
Yeah, like maybe two more questions. Let's go with two more questions.
Spencer is asking, when you released your first Reverb plugin, what was your expectation at the time as an independent plugin designer?
I was hoping that it would be a good advertisement for doing consulting.
Okay.
And it quickly became clear that, like, especially, okay, get this and another one of these out, and we might actually be able to make a living off of this. So, yeah, so it vastly exceeded my expectations, but it was also fairly low expectations. So,
all right. So maybe the last question then. So Mark is asking, can you comment on testing a Reverb plugin? So, and they say it sounds difficult and non-automatable. Do you have any thoughts?
Well, since I'm not a computer science person, I don't think I'd even know how to automate it. It's really about testing it with various source material. So it's like, I have like, I have a very standard, like, live project I bring up. For dry vocals, I have a dry vocal. There's a joke in the industry we all use Suzanne Vega's Tom's Diner acapella mix, which, because it's like dry, and after you hear it for 20 years, you realize it's not entirely dry, but you have to listen to it for a good long time before you start hearing the reverb in it. Drums, piano, I have guitars and synthesizers, but really, and then it's like send it to people, and you just have to try it on a variety of different listening materials and see how it is. So it's not really an automated test. It's like, okay, imagine like, what is the use for this? And like, and for example, stuff like, you know, it also depends on the intended function. For example, Valhalla Supermassive, I didn't really care how it sounded on drums. It's like, it's free. It's a big giant reverb. Is mostly designed using, like, I played the Moog Grandmother and the Prophet 6 a lot through it. It was a synthesis reverb.
So maybe you can ask one very last question, though, because there's one in the chat, which I find also really, really interesting, like at the very end. Whether there is another modern effects company that inspires you to go further, like in a similar way. So Peter's saying maybe in a similar way that the Beatles and the Beach Boys inspired each other.
I admire a lot of effects companies, but it's like for a lot of different ways. It's like you can admire them for the technology, you can admire them for the business model, you can admire them for their ethics. Like, for example, Sound Toys is done really good in business. There's no studio that you go into that doesn't have Echo Boy in it. And then they also did some really amazing donations during June, and they've done like fundraising before, like, you know, like, and I really admire that from, like, I admire their business and I admire their personal, or like, you know, their political, like personal political stuff is really cool. I think that Fab Filter really shows what a flatter supply can sound like, where it's really like, or can look like, that's really visually gorgeous. As far as other reverb developers, I mean, there's a lot that I think are great. I definitely have a lot, like Michael Carnes has worked with both Lexicon and then really with Exponential Audio. He did some, I really felt he set the bar for like what a plug-in reverb, how transparent it could be. I think that a lesser known company that I think is amazing, Liquid Sonics, he's done work in both Convolution, but his latest reverb is, I believe it's algorithmic. I think it's called Cinematic Rooms, and it's stunning. And this is a case where he's done work. He's done Seventh Heaven, where he did stuff based on both Convolution of Bricasti, and then he's done his own sort of Bricasti influenced stuff. And now he's doing just this pure algorithmic space. So I think he's a really brilliant developer. I think Martin Lin from Relab has done a great job with his stuff. I mean, Fab Filter, again, like their Pro R reverb is really nicely transparent and a beautiful interface. I don't know. There's a lot of different people that I really admire in this space. It's not just like the old, like, you know, David Griesinger, Christopher Moore, Quantec, those companies. I think those are great, but I see people doing really good work nowadays. And different work. Like, it all fits in together, which is nice.
Awesome. Well, we need to wrap things up for our last talk. So we have one more speaker. Thank you very much, Sean, for all of your input. People are really showing a lot of appreciation in the chat, and thank you for your time.
Thank you for having me. That's great.